Okay, well, welcome to our last session, week 11 of Making Sense of Education and Educational Technologies. And in this session, we're going to round things up with looking at the concept of transforming education. Over the last 10 weeks, we've looked at lots of different aspects of educational technology and a whole range of theories and policy development processes. But many of these have been used many times in the past without necessarily making major changes to the way we go about education. And indeed, some critics suggest that we haven't made any really significant change to education in the last 1,000 years. What are your thoughts about how education has changed as a result of new technologies? Let's pick that one. Has it changed? Okay, so it's changed massively. In what way? Yes, our students today are better connected and hopefully develop a better perspective on the world because of that interconnection. Not all schools and education systems are that, but certainly there is the potential, and there's good examples of where schools are developing really strong global perspectives. And in some quarters, we call that internationalization. And yes, communication is now much easier, for better or for worse. That's certainly an aspect of education that has changed. Our ability to communicate with one another is now almost 24/7, and certainly much easier than it used to be, where you would need to make appointments and hope people turned up and all the rest. Good, around differentiation. That's certainly one of the big hopes of educational technology, to be able to transform education through differentiation of each student's individual needs, and ideally over a long-term progress for that, where their specific needs are tracked throughout their lifetime, ultimately, and all of those needs are met through various approaches. There's a huge amount of potential in that one. We certainly haven't exhausted the potential of that. There's a long way to go, but it's certainly one of the big aspects where educational technology has a lot to offer education. Yes, good for students with disabilities. Sorry, I might have misread that. Differentiation for learners. Yes, and certainly for students that do have impairments, there's a lot of technologies, and indeed many of our new educational technologies come out first for students with disabilities and are then eventually mainstreamed because of the benefits that they offer everyone. And yes, the whole democratization of education and being allowing lots of students to have better access to education is another big area where ICT and certainly the internet is playing a strong role. Okay, so that's some good ideas there. So let's now get into some concepts around transformation. Hopefully you're working on your implementation plans where you're going to make a significant change to your organization that you've selected. But now we're going to look at some of the really ambitious goals that you might want to consider as part of that implementation plan and the transformation that you wish to see happen in your own organization. So there's a number of readings for us to have a look at tonight, and let's get straight into one of the first ones. Let me just bring it up. So this website, whoops, that's not even a website yet. It's a link to the website. Here's the website. This lets us look at a number of aspects of transformation, which are listed on the left. And they're divided into 3 levels of transformation, red through yellow to green. And the assumption is that we should be aiming towards the green end, where traditionally we've been at the red end. So the first one of these is around the setting of challenges and the degree at which we're setting ambitious aims, not just for our students, but also for our institutions. And here we see some examples. So for the faculty, an example of a college where the majority of the students were receiving aid and so forth. And the faculty set themselves a more ambitious challenge to try to overcome the historic difficulties around that particular institution. And likewise for student examples, pushing students to undertake more challenging activities than they might feel themselves ready for, such as advanced mathematics classes or special programs, musical programs or sporting programs. And so the first section of the page identifies the characteristics of the challenges. And the second bit are some suggestions, some approaches that you might be able to consider in your implementation plans for achieving some of these. So for the organisation, they use debriefing sessions with students and employ students to do various things and so forth. And for students, what's this one saying about leadership opportunities and going into contests and problem-solving activities to push themselves beyond what might be available within their own organisation. So that's just one of the transformational processes, the degree to which we're pushing students and faculties and the organisation to adopt change. Now, the complexity of what is taught is the next one. And at its base level, we've got straight memorization. Then we've got trying to have students understand what they're learning. And at the other extreme is around problem solving and engaged with project-based learning and problem-based learning and inquiry-based learning and those sort of approaches. And again, you can sort of see a couple of the examples. So for staff, it might be having staff work on their own self-education, supporting master's programs or graduate diploma programs or professional development programs, and pushing staff to go beyond what expected knowledge is and understanding of their content and how to teach and all the other aspects. Through to students, also doing the same. We're more familiar with students in that space. And a couple of examples that you can also engage with around that. Those examples showing up on your screen? Let me just check. Okay, they are, good. Okay, so do you have any comments or questions about those first two? So setting challenges in your organization and trying to move the cognitive complexity of what's happening, the difficulty of the learning. So the next couple, one is around control. So this is whether or not everything is controlled and decided upon by the faculty, through to whether or not everything is, or the majority of things are decided upon by the learner, or at least the learner having a strong say in what they're being expected to do and how they do it. And there's lots of examples that you can draw upon for that. So from the teacher's perspective or the faculty perspective, allowing students to ask questions and to challenge and to set their own learning activities and even assessment. And similarly for the students, learning about how to work within that learner-centered environment, taking their own metacognitive understanding of their learning processes and being able to actually direct their learning to where it's needed. That can be quite a significant challenge for students. It does have a lot of benefits, but it does mean the students need to be more actively involved, which means extra work. And they have to then see the value of that rather than just being told what to do and approaching learning from that perspective. Next one is around delivery, whether or not it's primarily presentation-based, discussion-based, or the current terminology is around active learning, where students are actively involved in the learning process. And so in this case, the students are involved in a project-based learning activity and use the process of going through that to support their learning rather than just watching presentations or even having discussions. And Emma asks us these ideas we should be considering in our implementation plan. I have a few of them, but not all. No, Emma, certainly you couldn't hope to integrate everything into a single implementation plan. But what you should have is a couple that are the focus of the change that you want to see happen in your organization. But no, you wouldn't be expected, and it would be a very, very brave organization and organizational leader to try to implement all aspects that are possible in one activity, one process. Certainly what you would hope is that once you've implemented one or a couple, that you would then start looking to how to then incorporate more. But doing too much can be just as problematic as doing too little. So no, while you're being shown a lot of options, you're not expected to undertake all of the options. So a couple of others, the design of the learning experience and the learning environment, whether or not it's quite rigid and set or whether or not it's very malleable. And we're seeing that a lot in our classroom spaces at the moment, where we're using furniture that can be moved around and repurposed and restructured in different ways. And indeed, many buildings are now being designed to also support that approach, so that different classroom or different learning spaces can be created by moving walls around or dividers, or even having very large open plan spaces. So lots of different ways to ensure that the learning space and learning environment is modular. And ideally, into the future, it is then responsive so that it can actually react and change depending upon the needs. So it may be the lighting changes or the sound insulation and barriers can change. There's lots of different ways you can create responsive learning environments. And of course, that's a bit easier in an online learning environment where we can have our pages change depending upon who is actually looking at the page or where their learning pathway is, and so forth. Whereas in the past, we might have had every student look at the same static page of information. More and more now, the information pages and the web pages that students will engage with will respond to the learner depending upon their progress in the learning activities or their level of achievement through various measures and so forth. Another one is efficacy. And this is how we actually engage with our students and our faculty to want to do new innovative things or to try out approaches and be engaged with the opportunities that they're presented with. Now, part of this will be incorporated into your change management plan around your stakeholders, but it can also be a more general approach throughout an organization to have students and faculty responsive to wanting to see things improve all the time, and to ideally also then be leading and driving that process. Feedback's another one. How much we actually seek feedback from our staff and our students. At the base level, that's through evaluations. Then it could be through developing a reporting mechanism and process, or it could be a rating system or a ranking system and a whole range of other approaches in that, through to formal assessment processes where we have criteria and we measure against that criteria. And that may involve students and staff and parents and other organisations and so forth. So there's a whole range of different ways we can go about seeking feedback on what's working and what's not working. And that leads us into measurement, which is determining the level or the quality of what we're doing. And this can be down from subjective approaches, such as surveys and things of that nature, through to objective determinations where we might measure against a series of specific, not just criteria, but measurement points. So part of it could be through things such as the NAPLAN or national testing programs and comparing our organisation to other organisations in that approach. It could be having external evaluators come in and conduct an evaluation of the organisation, but that can also be down to individual students. It could rely upon students making their own determinations of their progress, through to having teachers being involved in that determination process, and at a higher point, having external people make that determination, because teachers are quite involved in the learning process in most cases, hopefully, and they may not be necessarily the best people to make an objective determination of students' progress in terms of their learning. And there's various mechanisms, and part of that is to have external assessment, which is one of the mechanisms that we have for objective determination of student progress. But that can also extend down to how the school is going or the organisation is going, where you can have the staff fill in surveys and make subjective determinations, through to having external people come in and provide an evaluation of how things are going. Ownership's another one. Oh, sorry. You have a few of them, but not all. School opinion surveys. Yes, well, school opinion surveys would be, generally, it would be seen as a subjective determination. Even if it was from parents or students, they all have an invested interest in seeing the organisation do well. So they can't be objective. They can still give some good feedback and useful material to work on, but it won't be objective. So to really get objective determinations of success and so forth, you need some form of external measurement process. And there are various ways of doing that. There's lots of companies that go into schools and do that. You can get people that go around to schools. I've done it in a couple of schools where they've brought us in as objective assessors of how the school is going and try to identify what's going on. So there's ways of doing that. But we just need to be clear that just asking the people involved is not necessarily the best approach. But they certainly shouldn't be excluded, because it's an important part of the next one, which is ownership, where people want to feel involved in the decision-making processes in an organisation. They don't just want to have everything directed by the school leadership or the administration or the department or whatever level we're talking at. Then it goes to the next level, is where that ownership is guided, where they have some decision making, but it's sort of supported by their leaders who guide them towards the correct decisions in various ways. And certainly we do that a lot with our students, where we may give them various levels of ownership and authority to do things, such as run a student council or a student magazine, but there'll be generally a faculty member that will have oversight to make sure that what's published in the student magazine is still within the boundaries of what's expected within the organisation. Or for a student council, they can't just decide to give everyone a 4-day week holiday and only come to school 1 day a week. There'll be faculty members and staff members and teachers that will guide them towards making more appropriate decisions. But through to where students and staff may be fully self-directed, where they do have full say, and often their say is can override the say of staff members, because the learning process is really their process. The staff, teachers and academics and so forth are employed to support their learning, and if they can demonstrate the capacity to be self-directed and make good decisions, then their decisions can, in a self-directed environment, take priority. Now, it's quite rare for that environment to occur. It has been tried, and there's been some fairly celebrated failures of self-directed schools where the students basically run the school and make all the decisions, because we do excuse me, we do need to remember that in most educational environments, the students are immature by definition. They're still maturing, they're still developing, and they may not be in the best position to make those decisions. But where it's possible, it can be very effective. And certainly we can have self-directed staff environments where the staff make decisions. And there have been a number of schools set up to do that. They don't tend to last, unfortunately, but there's been lots of attempts to establish educational environments where the decisions are all made in a democratic way by the staff without any specific leaders. Okay, let's pause there for a bit and hear your thoughts on some of those ideas. So again, these are just some of the transformational concepts that you might want to incorporate into your own educational environment that you're going to be proposing to develop your implementation plans to achieve. But they'll also, if you look at some of these, they make good vision statements, like the vision of the environment of the school, of your organization, may be to achieve this sort of type of engagement or transformational aspect. How can it be for both staff and students, and how that ownership can be used? Well, yes, you couldn't have an environment that is owned by both staff and students, although maybe you could have it owned equally, and they could have equal say in what occurs, but that would then involve students having a true equal say, and given that there's normally more students than staff, they probably would then have the overriding say in a truly student self-directed environment. So I think we can all imagine reasons why that doesn't occur very often, but you should also be able to see some of the possible advantages, particularly in self-directed learning and student empowerment, of having such a learning space that was working well. And more we're developing environments like that, particularly at the tertiary level and certainly at the upper secondary level, where students are no longer given schedules, for example, and that they'll then approach various teachers and staff members when they want to engage with a learning process, rather than being forced into a particular structure. And they have a lot of say about what they then learn and how they learn it. And in that respect, there's quite a number of examples where schools are engaging at that level. In an organization, would that be a little more even, perhaps? Yes, there's lots of examples, and most educational organizations make some attempt of giving student voice and having students having the ability to have some say and ownership of their learning process, even if it's through some sort of student council or a student leadership group. But how much they've got any actual real power is really determined by their ownership. Can they actually go against the prevailing views of others? If they can't, then they really don't have any true ownership. They may have a little bit of guided ownership, but mostly it's directed. Okay, let's look at the last few. Oops. So the next one is on relationship. Something that we suggest is one of the most essential parts of the educational interactions, and one of the areas where people are hoping that robots and technology won't take over in the short term. But the engagement that we have with our students and the degree of emotional investment can be very important, particularly at certain age levels. Certainly the very younger students, it's a very intrinsic part of their learning. And also during adolescence and into the early tertiary years, having identified mentors and people that they can engage with and ask questions of in a secure environment is a very important part of any educational experience. So again, there's a whole range of different things. We can be emotionally distant, as the medical profession attempts to be, so that the decisions that you make aren't influenced by your emotional engagement with your students. That's not normally advocated for in education, because we see the strong advantages of emotional investment. And indeed, there's a number of studies and research that's been done that shows that students learn far, far greater when they've got some engagement with their teachers and lecturers and so forth, and a lot less effective if they are distant and unengaged with. So that's another aspect that you could consider. It's not really a strong one around educational technology at the moment, for better or for worse, although it is an area that people are looking at, particularly in terms of robotics and online tutoring systems, which have a strong educational focus, but don't have any real relationship building aspect. And yes, rapport is very important in enriching educational environments, and certainly that's an area that's very important. Well, many consider it very important, but it is being challenged. There are a number of online courses, for example, where students just work through activities and so forth and have very little relationship building between other students or between whoever wrote the course material and so forth. And they are proving successful in some environments. So we can't say that relationship is an absolute need, but it certainly is an area that most teachers value greatly. And thankfully, most students also value greatly, but not all. The scope of learning. So this is how broad the student's education should be. So it could be purely around what they have to learn for the test, for example, or have to learn for the curriculum, what's set down, and not engaging with other distracting elements that they could be learning about, through to learning about a discipline, such as the discipline of science. So going beyond just the curriculum elements that they might need to learn, to looking at the broad engagement with science, with the world, and with our understanding of the universe and all the rest, through to an interdisciplinary understanding, where we see actually how different disciplines relate to each other, how science affects the humanities, how the humanities affects science, how science might affect the arts, and how the arts might affect mathematics, and all of the interrelationships between disciplines. Now, that's a very difficult one to get to, and some attempts to achieve that have been done through, particularly in the United States and in parts of Europe, where they try to have a comprehensive post-secondary education before they go to university, where often it's called liberal arts, where students engage with a whole range of different disciplines, including the science and the STEM subjects, and how they interrelate with each other, and we can learn from different aspects of those. And yes, STEAM is a new approach to an extent. It was framed as interdisciplinary, although many people are arguing that it's not strongly interdisciplinary because it's actually excluding a whole lot of other disciplines other than the STEM or the STEAM disciplines. And yes, it is difficult to implement. That's why it's often done at a post-secondary level, but it is often attempted in the primary years where there's the content is not so complex and we can actually see the interrelationships between concepts a lot stronger. But unfortunately, in our upper secondary, we tend to have very much siloed into disciplines, and it's difficult to actually achieve good integration between those disciplines. Now, many universities have recognized that problem and are trying to now create more interdisciplinary programs, but universities also have the same issue in that people start differentiating and don't really have a good understanding of each other's disciplines. So doing true interdisciplinary learning is becoming harder and harder as we're getting more specialized, as the complexity of what you need to learn in a particular discipline is increasing. But throughout history, we've learned that most fundamental advancements and changes have occurred by people that have a good understanding of the interactions between disciplines. And they then see new opportunities that people that are just enmeshed in a discipline fail to see. So there's lots to be advocated for around interdisciplinary learning, but it is a challenge, as you mentioned, with STEM and STEAM, adding the arts into design, technology, also science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Okay, the next one is around self-awareness and metacognition. This is how much our students and our staff understand the learning process, but also a whole lot of other processes. It might be the processes around maturation, around going through adolescence, or processes around behavior and behavior management. But how much we actually understand ourselves and how that can affect our learning and our engagement with others and our positive outlook on life and a whole range of other aspects. And that again can relate to staff and to students. Now, second last one, social orientation. This is how much we're focused on individual work, through to collaborative and group work, through to a focus on community work, where it's not just working within a group, but working within a collection of organizations. So it may be students getting involved in community organizations or international groupings, and not just working in a group with other students in another school internationally, but working, say, with Greenpeace or with the UN or scientific organizations in a true community approach. And again, this can also relate to staff as well. A lot of our staff only work individually or just within a small collaborative group in their own school, and not necessarily within their wider profession through professional associations or other organizations and groups. And the school itself can also be very much like that, where a school may just work around its own structures, or it might work collaboratively with a number of similar schools, or it might be integrated in with the entire community and work with school levels above and below, with the universities, with community organizations and industries, and a whole range of other aspects. And then the final one is around transparency. How much the organisation is willing to allow others to see what's happening. Is it a private organisation where everything is protected and only those that need to know about certain aspects? This might include students. Like, do students in your organisation know the implementation plan, or do they know how much the staff are paid, or the hiring and firing processes for staff? There's a whole range of things that are often kept private, through to everything being public and it being a very transparent organisation where things are all above board and decisions can be challenged and questioned and discussed. This is so important for rural communities in terms of social orientation. I think we were back onto, and yes, the interconnections. But for rural communities, often have a better social orientation to large inner city or large city-based organisations, because in a smaller community, you tend to have to integrate with other groups simply because you know about them and you're having interrelationships with them all the time because of the closeness of the community. Whereas if you've got a school in a large suburban area, it's much easier to not engage with the wider community. For one thing, you've got staff that are drawn from lots of different communities, same with students, and there's no real one understanding of that local community-based structure around the school or the education organisation. So while there are often challenges in rural communities, there are advantages also in yes, that was the point I was trying to elucidate. Okay, so as always, back to you guys. This is meant to be your time to ask questions and to discuss the readings that you've done during the week. So what are your thoughts around these aspects of transformation? Wonderful. Are there any other aspects of transformation that you think could be included in such a list? That sounds great. Helping equity groups. Yes, that's a good point in terms of our engagement with wider community expectations and issues and trying to drive that process forward, to not just looking at our own equity groups within our community, but also assisting others, such as opening the school up, say, for refugee students, or other aspects around those issues. So yes, the whole aspect around equity is important. Any other elements or aspects that anyone can think of? Okay. Well, let's go on to the next reading then. So this is one from Microsoft. So it has a somewhat commercial perspective from their approach, but they do, large organizations such as Microsoft and Google and Apple do a good job at trying to develop policy documents. They do always have some aspect around their technologies, but they do still try not to be too focused on the commercial side of things and to provide good coverage of where education is going, particularly related to technology. But you do always need to keep in mind that they do have a particular focus around their particular technologies, and they may not as strongly represent other technologies, or indeed the not using technology in certain circumstances. But let's have a look at this one. So this is sort of their big picture vision. They have a series of what are called the 21st century pedagogies, which is the content that they would like to see taught. And here we have that point that you brought up, Sarah, around inclusion and accessibility, and the idea around differentiation, in this case called personalised learning, the whole aspect of learning communities and establishing those, and the aspect of learning environments and creating strong elements around that. They've got the various leadership and policy processes to try to achieve that, and we're going through that through your implementation plan process, developing similar concepts. And the final one down the bottom, which they try to de-emphasize in this image, is the technology that's going to support those aspects. So let's pop through to a few things. This document is structured around some conversations. So again, similar visions in terms of outcomes they would like to achieve in their educational organisation. So one is anywhere, anytime learning. So being able to use mobile devices and online technologies to allow learning to occur wherever you want it to occur and whenever. This one's around the strategic planning process and sustainability. So in your focus, this is more around your what do we call it? In the implementation plan, it's around the elements of, what did I call it? Change management. Monitoring and evaluation we talked about in the last document, but processes of ongoing improvement and continuous improvement being built into what we're trying to achieve. That whole concept around equitable access and accessibility. And this is a big one in lots of different areas. It could be around gender, or age, or disability, or language of instruction, whether or not they're from the first language of instruction for the organisation. There's a whole range of different things to try to, as much as possible, allow every student to learn as effectively as they can. Making their learning actually of value and of use for students. One of the current arguments is that a lot of what we teach in schools is irrelevant to students, because by the time they leave school, so many of their jobs will have disappeared and all the rest. And around that, we have a whole, in this case, the 21st century skill set, which is those higher order thinking skills and processes that students will be able to draw upon, regardless of any particular discipline or job that they might have envisaged as part of that learning process. The whole aspect around community building and being global citizens and being engaged with issues and organisations around the world, and more locally around developing communities and support structures to support their learning, be that within their school or within their local friendship groups or within their local community or even internationally, and how to foster and engage with those sort of activities and communities. And then building leaderships both for students and for the organisation, developing teachers into leaders, developing students into leaders, and improving the leadership of our executives and our school leaders. Okay, so that's a whole range of different elements there. They've got a few diagrams that sort of combine those. Of course, we want to use technology effectively to support all those different areas. And we've looked at many of these ideas throughout the course. Let's pop down to, there's the table. So here we have a list of elements and things that could be incorporated into their implementation plan. In this case, they're called transformational plans. So in setting your vision, making sure that it's holistic, collaborative, and systemic, and guided by a shared vision. In terms of your policy document or your implementation plan, making sure that it is long range, has plans for funding and policy development, and supports the transformation and being flexible and responsive and so forth. That you've got a monitoring process, having that equitable aspect you could incorporate. So all of these different elements that you might want to consider incorporating into your own implementation plan that aren't necessarily ones that we've discussed in other contexts. Any thoughts or comments? Essentially, this document is just another way of helping organizations think through the issues that they need to consider in their implementation plans. Most of these things you should have already considered through the structures that we've built into your process, but there are a few extra little ones in there that you might want to consider. Okay. Anyone still there? Oh, good. Okay, let's look at our final document then, or final website. Now, this one is really looking at some really transformational educational concepts that have the potential to challenge how we go about learning. And MIT is one of the significant universities that are exploring these concepts. And there's a number of different areas, 4 different areas that they're looking at. Well, we'll get to personalized learning in a second. Or did you have another? Okay, let's pop it. So the first one that MIT is looking around is around open sharing. And this whole idea that we should share as much as possible. Now, they've set up what was called the Open Courseware program, where they made all of their learning resources available for any other organization to use. So all their PowerPoint slides, all their resources is all available for anyone anywhere around the world to come along and use in their own universities or courses. They've also set up a number of spaces such as the D space, which can share digital materials like video clips and PDF documents and a whole range of other things. They've also got another initiative called the iLabs, which are remote laboratories, so that students from around the world can do experiments in these online remote laboratories. And the final one they've got is a thing called iMote, which is a system for automatically grading essays. And so you can submit essays to the iMote system and it will automatically mark them. And a lot of people are looking with interest at that. And don't worry, I'm not submitting yours for iMote marking, but it is an area where educational technology is supporting transformation in assessment. And as it evolves, it may be a significant change to how we go about teaching and learning, where we can actually have a lot more assessment. Now, it's marked by a computer. Now, the advantage of that is we can then get things marked much more quickly, and also have it be more iterative so that you can get the feedback and then make changes and then submit a new version and hopefully then improve your assessment or your outcomes of your learning through that process. Because at the moment that is hindered by the time it takes for human assessors to mark and give back and so forth. So they're just under open sharing 4 different initiatives that MIT is looking at to do that, and you can look at those in more detail if you wish. There's a few other ones in there as well, but the iMote system is one that we just talked about, but they've also got a few others. This one is around the design of the learning spaces. This is another learning space one to try to make it more interactive with different types of learning. So rather than, this is a new sort of framework for a lecture hall. So having all the students around different tables with screens all around the outside and having a different type of learning space. This is a project they're doing with Singapore, and another management system where they've got a range of different new approaches to learning management systems. But if you're after a few more additional initiatives, you can have a look at some of those activities. Now, another big concept that they're looking at is around collaboration and how to work interactively with different universities combining together and using video conferencing in the main to be able to engage with others. But there are a number of other initiatives in this sort of space around virtual reality and augmented reality, where people can come together and collaborate using some changes to technology. Now, active learning has been a big issue in a lot of organizations, and there's a number of different approaches being supported here as examples to try to have students not just sit in a lecture hall and receive information, but to actually actively engage with activities that develop their learning. So in our case, the hope was that you would have done the readings and we would be actively engaged with a discussion process rather than me just talking through and presenting information to you in a more traditional approach. And the final one is around learning spaces, and just mentioned a couple of those ideas, but moving from a traditional space and lecture hall through to different types of innovative learning environments. Okay. So that's a whole range of different ideas and concepts that you might be able to incorporate into your implementation plan. Any questions on any of those sort of ideas or thoughts, or have you got any of your own? Would you like to share what you're thinking about doing with your assignment? And you could get some feedback from myself or from your peers. Okay, you can fabricate your organization. You can make up what your organization is and the types of staff you have and all the rest. You can use real ones if you wish, but I don't need to know that. So you can make up how much funding you've got available, your staff, and things of that nature. But you can't necessarily fabricate ideas. You can come up with your own ideas, that's certainly fine, but you'll probably find that they've been thought of previously. But if you do come up with something original and new, that's wonderful. But do a bit of research and see if it has been thought of before, and incorporated? No, they don't have to be incredibly realistic. Well, they do have to be possible, and your plan has to be somewhat realistic. But in terms of your ambition, that's fine. You could be very ambitious and very optimistic around your organizational structure, but you do then need to then have a process and describe how it's going to be achieved. If you need money for that, if you need supportive staff, you can fabricate that and have that be incorporated in. But your implementation plan does need to be, to a certain extent, realistic. So if I just bring up the rubric for you. So this is the rubric upon which you'll be marked, and you will see there I know one of them had something to do with practicality. Yeah, so the analysis of change levers, a detailed analysis of change levers and a high level of practicality of proposed actions to achieve this vision. So yes, you can ask, certainly. You're stuck on a lever for change and stakeholder alignment strategies. Can you describe what you've written then? Essentially, you should have described who is involved in your organization, who are the change, or who are the stakeholders, and some of them should be challenging in some way, and you need to describe how you're going to go about getting them to support your vision. That's essentially a change lever. Wonderful. So why were you uncertain of that? Okay. But now's the opportunity to put forward any of your approaches and seek any advice and feedback. The assignment is due very soon, so this is really pretty much the last chance. Wonderful. Well, I look forward to seeing them in a couple of days. And hopefully everyone else is well on track. Haven't received it very much any questions from anyone else. So hopefully through the process, everyone has already worked out what they're going to be doing for your plans and are now ready to engage. And Sarah's just rejoined us or cloned herself. Sarah, do you have any questions about the assignment or any elements that you'd like clarification on? I guess not. Okay then, well, that pretty much wraps up the content for the course. We'll just let Sarah have a chance to ask any questions if she's sorted out her technical difficulties. But make sure you refer to this rubric. While the description is certainly important and is there to assist you, the rubric is what is going to be the final determiner of your grade. So make sure you do look at the rubric and think about how you would mark your assignment. Try to be objective. You may want to get someone else to read your assignment and then look at the rubric and see what they might apply to it. For some of you, make sure that you try and proofread your work before you submit. While I won't be marking you down on your English expression, it does certainly assist me in reading it and in engaging with the ideas that you're presenting, if it isn't too distracting as a result of the grammatical errors and other difficulties. Other than that, make sure you put some effort into that final section on evaluation of challenges. Certainly in the first assignment, I think a lot of people focused on the first criterias, and by the time they got to the last criteria, they didn't address it as strongly as they could have. So do make sure that you address the criteria relatively equally, because they are all equal in terms of their weighting. And Sarah, are you able to communicate with us? Wonderful. Do you have any questions on the assignment? Oh, wonderful. Okay. Well, very good. Well, I look forward to seeing that, and or have you already uploaded it? That's great, Sarah, and that's actually something I was just advising everyone to make sure that they do, is to do a good grammar check. And again, while I don't deduct marks for it, it does distract from me seeing the wonderful ideas that you're putting forward. And the easier that I can read through and engage with those ideas, the more disposed I am for identifying those wonderful ideas. Okay then, well, well, let's hope so. So that wraps up then the series of video conferences. Certainly you'll still be able to communicate with me by email, but other than that, we'll finish up now and you can get back to working on your assignments. And yes, conversations are sometimes really strong and vibrant and sometimes not, but it is difficult when there's only a couple of you, and I do understand the pressure it puts upon those of you that do turn up when there's only a couple of you to actually be part of the conversation. But thank you for your participation in the course, and also would ask that you complete your student and course evaluations at some stage. They're open now and they're open for a few more weeks, but it's always good to have those done. And good luck with your final assignment and with your engagement with educational technology, both in the rest of your master's program or when you're back out into employment and into the real world. Okay then. Well, good night, and I look forward to seeing your assignments and seeing all of you at some stage in the future.